Hello, everybody. It is January 7th and January 8th, maybe for some of you. It's nice to have you all here for our webinar with me, Leslie Nips, and Jane Peterson and Suzi Tucker, the faculty of the 4th Annual West Coast Constellations Intensive. Woohoo! Thank you all for gathering here today for an hour. I have my tea.
Mm-hmm.
How about anybody else? There we go.
All right.
Or coffee, or if you're drinking something harder than that, that's fine. Just glad to have you all. Again, my name is Leslie Nips. I'm going to be both sort of participating as part of the faculty today and hosting us and sort of walking us through this hour. A few bits of orientation. The most important for most of you is going to be the upper right-hand corner where you, some of these directions are different on tablets and phones, so you're just going to have to figure it out on your phone or your tablet. But upper right-hand corner on your computer will toggle speaker view versus gallery view. So if you like to see everybody, that's gallery view. And if you want the speaker to look big, you can put that on speaker view. That's a nice little function. Bottom left-hand corner is your ability to control your audio and your video. You can see a lot of people right now are choosing not to be seen. That's fine. We would love to see you. That would be nice. But we do understand if you're multitasking or something like that. And the mute, everyone's coming in automatically muted. We may unmute some people at some point to ask questions and to do shares. So that is, at the very bottom is the chat function. I will attempt to respond to questions that show up in the chat. I will do my very best. But I have found that talking and making sure I'm tending to the chat can get a little complicated. There's also down there under Manage Participants, a little, if you click on that, you'll notice an option to raise your hand, which is a little bit more visible to me and really flags that you've got a question going on. I do invite you. We have some amazing trainers and leaders in the constellations world here today. Start brewing your questions. What would you really like to ask of us today? What would you like to hear from us? So start thinking about that. So what I would like to do, as I mentioned before some of you came on, we got some RSVPs from different sources. I think there's a wide range of knowledge about constellations gathered here today. And I don't want to assume that everyone knows what that word constellations means, which may be frustrating for those of you who have been around it for quite a bit. But instead of explaining it, for those of you who maybe you've just decided to try this on, what the heck, it looks interesting. Welcome. And I'm not going to attempt a definition off the top. What I am going to do is be attentive to making sure by the end of the hour, you have a good sense of what it's about. I just want to start us out with doing constellation practice. And so I just want to invite everybody. Some of you may be driving, so take care of yourself. But to the degree that you can, just take a moment and connect with yourself. And one of the things that constellations work does is notice systems, notice the elements of systems. Zoom does this quite nicely. So you could look at the screen if you're on gallery view and just notice all the people who are here. And I'm certain we're going to be getting a flurry more people over the next few minutes. Just connect. You might close your eyes. And in whatever way this comes to you, whatever way your imagination presents this to you, I invite you to notice your ancestors, your lineage, the people you've come from. And however these people make you feel, that's fine. Some of us have a burst of love. Some of us have a burst of crankiness. Either is fine. It all belongs. It's usually more complicated than either or. And the people on the call today, just statistically, you're having life experiences. Life is showing up for you. You may be having really wonderful things arising in your life, or you may be having really challenging and difficult things arise in your life. So bringing all of who you are and your experience to the presence of your ancestors, just notice for a moment that they did too. They had fully human lives. And in some sense, they continue to have fully human lives on the other side in some way or another. They were born, they had joys, they had suffering. They were oppressed, they were oppressors. They fell in love, they fell out of love. They had children. And they faced their own ends. Just notice them. Notice these people you come from. And how each one has to be exactly where they are for you to be here now. And we're really glad you're here. Whatever you're experiencing. And then if you chose to close your eyes, you might open them again and just notice, again, in any way this presents itself to your imagination, the ancestors behind the other people on the call. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, 8, 16, 32. And we have 20 people on the call, but there's a lot more than that present. And just notice that. And then notice other people noticing your ancestors, which is usually quite a nice feeling. Okay. And then come all the way back. And again, I honor that many of you have chosen not to be seen. And if for any reason it might be nice to be seen, we would love to see you. But again, it is not required by any means. And I'm just realizing I should probably have my earbuds in. So now what I would like to do is I'd like to introduce our faculty to you, or not actually really introduce them, but invite them to introduce themselves. And so I'm just going to start with Jane Peterson, up by Portland, Oregon. And Jane and I have known each other for a while, but I think we first really got to know each other in 2015 around the Constellations Conference that was in San Diego. Just honored to have you here. And Jane, just introduce yourself and what you do a bit for the people who may not know you.
Okay, where to start?
I know.
I have like 3 different careers, and this is my third. And I'm actually now becoming a farmer. So I have a small 5-acre farm in Aurora, Oregon, which is outside of Portland. I met Bert in 1998. I think it was his first public tour. And I knew I was seeing something that I didn't understand, but that was quite different and captivating, and I was hooked. And I followed every lead I had. There wasn't a lot at that time that was available. There was a wonderful book from Zig Tucker. My hat's off to Suzi. But there wasn't a lot of resources, so I ended up, connecting with a lot of folks like Guntard Faber and Albrecht Marr and Hunter Beaumont and Bert, and so kind of made my own education, and realized that as I was starting to understand the work, if I didn't start teaching it, I would forget how I learned it and not be very useful to students. If I already knew how to do something, I couldn't show them how I got there. So I started teaching, and I ran into a fellow who was out of Hong Kong at a conference I was at. And he sort of grabbed me by the lapels one day after I did a little demo and said, "You must come to China." So I said, okay, scared out of my mind, thinking I didn't know anything at all, but I said, okay. And that launched a whole 16-year saga of international teaching and training. Because I have a background in organizations, and because I love those crazy places where people are enmeshed and entangled and families are enmeshed and entangled with them, I also do work with organizational constellations as well as.
Oops, we just had a freeze.
Oh, did I freeze?
Right. You were saying organizational constellations as well as family constellations. So
right.
It was only a moment.
Okay. So I have a practice here in the Portland area where I work with clients and teach and farm. And that's kind of what I'm doing right now, is trying to start a permaculture farm and start a farm community and create a new model for semi-urban farming. So,
and I want you to know, I'm going to come back to that permaculture, Jane, so you have a chance to prepare yourself, because I know it's relevant to the intensive theme.
Yes, it is.
And so
it's actually, there's a lot of handy stuff in permaculture that helps you understand constellations, as I found.
Yes. Great. So I want us to return to that. I'm sure it'll be really interesting to everybody here. And just again, if there's anyone brand new to constellations, I wrote on the chat, Bert equals Bert Hellinger, who is the founder of this work. And the other names Jane mentioned are some of the earliest people who helped it spread in the very, very early years of the work, but back in the 80s, right, Jane, or early 90s?
Yeah, I actually had the opportunity to sit with Jakob Schneider at one point. He was there when Bert, in the basement in Bavaria with Bert Hellinger, as he was starting to, and it was Siglinda and Jakob, and hear their stories about how this unfolded, which was really quite fun.
I bet.
Yeah, sort of discovery by doing.
The best kind. So, Suzi, would you please, I'm going to unmute you, introduce yourself to the crowd from the other side of the country, of the United States.
Thank you. So Jane, I actually didn't realize we met probably around the same time, and I sort of hadn't put that together. So that's interesting to me. And all the names made me think of two names that I want to add to people's just very, very abstract list, because when the names come up, you'll go, oh, I know that name. And one is Harold Honan, with whom I worked for many years, organizing for Bert Hellinger on the East Coast. And Harold has kind of disappeared from the constellation scene, but he was a masterful teacher, really a wonderful therapist. And he was my muscle, I would say. I was very shy in the beginning. I'm much less shy now. And he beat down the doors, and he got us into the Family Therapy Networker, and he got us into, without him, actually, is actually, thank you, Jane, Zig Tucker. The Zig is Jeffrey K. Zig, who is an Ericksonian hypnotherapist, really kind of protege of Milton H. Erickson. And Bert learned Ericksonian hypnosis through Jeff Zig. So it took me years to understand their connection. Neither of them really, I don't think they went out and drank beer together, but Bert was very instrumental in bringing, Erickson was instrumental in Jeff's work, and Jeff was instrumental in bringing Bert Hellinger here. So great gratitude to both of them. I'm talking like this because really I accidentally stumbled into all of these people. I certainly had no plan to do this work. I was in publishing and I was mid-career. I was like at the height of my career in publishing when my publishing company was sold to a much larger company. And so Jeff and I started a little company, and Bert Hellinger submitted a manuscript. And I kind of tell the joke, which is pretty tired, I guess, at this point, but I never really made the decision to do the work. But like Jane, I would say that there was something, I loved all the therapists I learned from, and I loved all of their work. And there was something different, wider, I hesitate to say deeper, but wider than any of the particular therapies I had come across. And I learned later, really, it was because this was much more philosophical, and that Bert really saw himself as a philosopher. And I think what kind of hooked me was this, and continues to, was this multifaceted idea of belonging. And in Leslie's opening, I really start thinking about the ancestry, thinking, my whole question, most of our questions are around belonging. How do we belong? Often in quite difficult ways we find to belong. And one really important, I think, dropping of the veils is that we belong to others' belonging, right? So when we talk about the ancestry, for me, it's not a terribly abstract concept. It's actually a very practical concept. How do I belong? How did I belong to my own parents? How did they belong to theirs? And as Leslie pointed out, we don't have to go very far back to think about belonging to huge forces and huge historical sweeps and huge repressions and oppressions, and what does that mean in my little life? So going in and then coming back out again. So the work for me has this really simple on some level and very profound aspect that I am still discovering. So as a facilitator, I would say that the day that I am a little bored, the day that I think I know about you or you or you or you is the day I will leave this work. Because it will be the day that somehow my mind and body is saying, shut off, Suzi, shut off. So that's a little bit about me.
Which makes me happy because I find it very unlikely you're going to get bored.
This is true. I would be surprised, and I might say, "Gee, why are you bored?"
And then you're instantly on board again. So.
Exactly.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And then I'll do a little introduction of myself as well. I'm over here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I am of a very different generation in terms of the development of constellations than Suzi and Jane are. I call myself third wave constellations. I was trained by the people like Suzi and Jane. I received a lot of learning from them, but I had different specific trainers. So I'm a couple of levels, even though I had the honor of seeing Bert and Sophie Hellinger work in Mexico City, 2015, one of the last times he ever worked publicly, which I'm very grateful for. I cannot claim really original learning from him, other than, of course, he's the founder, where we all learn from him, for those of us who learn this work. And my claim to fame is that I seem to like to organize. I seem to like to get constellation people, find constellation people like this together, so that they can thrive and enjoy themselves and have a really good time, and that everyone who has the benefit of being in their presence as, students or clients or participants or people on this call can also have a really good time together. That seems to be what I do from the directing of the US conference in 2015 in San Diego, up to creating the intensive, which is now in its 4th year. And I really do invite you all to consider participating, and it's going to be marvelous in June. Like Suzi, this is not my first career, like both of these people, not my first career. I started out as an Episcopal priest. Yay! Did a classic parish ministry burnout. It's very difficult work, I have to tell you. Jane and I could have long conversations about organizational dysfunction in the modern church. However, many of the things I really prized about that work, which was meeting people in particular circumstances, in particular moments in their lives. I remember being wet behind the ears priest and a guy walking in the room and saying, I'm having an affair and I haven't told my wife yet. And sitting there going, is he talking to me? I was completely unready for this moment. But this is the next 12 years. We're filled with moments like this. And it's interesting with Suzi, sort of the end of the spectrum of these large belongings. And then she said, in our little lives. And part of what I love about constellations are those specific moments, that specific abortion, that specific love who went off to war and didn't come back, that specific brother who betrayed the brother, the specific grandfather who went off to the camps and never returned. There's something very tender about recovering the specific stories, and the movement of including what has been lost, that is at the heart of Constellation's work, shows up in these very tender and precious particularities. And for me, that feels like the old pastoral work. And I really, really enjoy that part of it. So, and I come to you today as the founder and the organizer of this. I do want to introduce briefly, just so that you know, Christina, would you just do a big old hello? Christina is our program assistant for the intensive. If you decide to get more involved and to go, you may get to know Christina better than any of us, because she's the person who's managing the registrations and will be organizing roommates and that sort of stuff. And so she's doing a lot of the practical on the ground work. Christina, thank you for being here. So good to have you. And she is also a fellow facilitator as well. I just want to return my attention to the group. It's so good to have you here from wherever you are in the world. I do invite you, as you've been listening to us, if questions have been arising, feel free to hit the raise your hand button, or to put something in the chat. But for right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn back to Jane and ask you about this falling apart to come together theme, which is the title. For those of you who do not know, the full title of our event is Falling Apart to Come Together, Navigating Transitions in Global and Personal Identity. With 2 words, transitions and identity, seeming very important to us in our initial conversations. So Jane, what comes to you today?
That's like a fairly big conversational topic.
It is.
So I think one of the things that attracted me to that theme is this idea of scales, which is what you were talking about this. And Suzi, also, you mentioned this very large scale to small scale worlds that we live in, that we're touched by. And part of my exploration has been, we built a house out here, and in doing so, we ran across something called the Living Building Challenge, which looks at how to build healthy houses. But more importantly, what we got to see was the big picture of what we're doing with this earth, and how our practices, whether it's building, whether it's agriculture, whether it's just the way we live in cities, whether it's single-use plastic packaging, whatever it is, the practices that we have show a profound disconnection from life, from let alone our ancestors, that we've just really kind of lost our way. And so I wanted to, and sometimes when you have a structure, it does have to fall apart for a new structure to emerge. So there is if you look at changes in ecology, if you look at how ecosystems shift, and we're in a big experiment with that on a global scale right now, there's this point where things tip and there's a falling apart of the old structures, which also liberates the energy that's needed for new structures to arise. And it feels like in many ways, down to our particular lives, where we run into things that we can't keep doing that the same way, we have to change, things kind of fall apart for us, to larger ecosystems and larger economies, that we're in this process right now as a species of really coming up against the limits of the old ways and having to look at how do we fall apart in a way that is regenerative? How do we fall apart to the old ways, in ways that offer us the possibility of creating something healthy and creating something that will sustain, which includes, our connection to life, connection to ancestors. A lot of my interest in the constellation work is both in how we construct identity out of our interactions, and including with our parents and what they transmit, and the body. And so how do we reconnect with ourselves, with where we come from, with this earth in a healthy way? So that's really how I see this theme, is honoring the falling apart. When I was working with people who are going through grief, I realized that falling apart is a natural part of that process. And that's what, if we've suffered a loss, allows us to come together in a way that incorporates that loss in a healthy way. So it's this idea of falling apart as a healthy, natural process that allows us the opportunity, if we take it, to generate something new, generate something that could be healthier and sustainable. And so we're out here in this little farm trying to walk our talk on the steep end of the learning curve here about being farmers. But yeah, I think for me, that's kind of how I relate to that.
Well, and could you say a word while you're at it? One of your workshops is going to be on climate grief.
Yes.
So say a word about, like, how do we even work with that? I mean, it's too big.
Right. It feels too big. And yet my observation is that even though conceptually it's hard for us to wrap our minds around global change, like those words sound so big and so distant. And yet I think on a visceral level, on a feeling level, we notice that there are like 70% fewer bugs, and the bird population is dropped by a quarter, like we are seeing emptier skies. There's a way where I think we're experiencing the shifts in our bodies and our psyches, and this feeling of loss that sort of permeates a lot of people's experience. It's hard for us to name that as being the disconnection from this, the losses that we're experiencing in our ecosystem. And so we have to find ways. So a lot of times what we do when we don't like the way we feel is we block it out, right? We just don't feel it. And so there's a place where we have to come into contact in a constructive way with what we're experiencing as human beings right now. We are not going back to the old climate. Not that is not probably going to happen. So there are going to be losses. There are going to be changes, big changes. And on a personal level and on a larger level, how do we embrace that rather than push it away, so that we can move through that and take constructive action where we live, take constructive action where we are. So grief is a natural, healthy process. And how do we move into it and through it rather than just trying to shut it out?
Well, and it seems like the bit that we've implied in our title is that the coming together is a really critical bit, so that the falling apart can be constructive rather than merely destructive.
Right.
Which it can be.
Right. The one thing we've learned about grief is that in order for people to grieve, they need containment.
Right.
In order to fall apart, there needs to be some kind of support. And at this point, we have to offer that to each other. We have to figure out how to do that.
And I'm really hoping that we can play in that space at the intensive, the letting some falling apart happen, but within having come together
Right.
For that. And don't worry, not too much falling apart.
Healthy falling apart. Useful falling apart.
Just the right amount, right?
Exactly. Right.
Suzi, your thoughts on this? And by the way, I think Suzi wordsmithed this particular falling apart to come together. She's our poet. So I think she came up with the specific wording of that.
Doesn't mean I know what it means, Jane.
as the best poets, right? I mean, the words come first,
right? But as Jane was talking, I was thinking, yes, exactly, yes. I kind of don't know if I have anything else to say, but an image did come to me. So when you talked about grief, Jane, and I've spoken about this many times, there was one year in 2009 where I lost everybody. I lost my mother, I lost my cousin, I lost my husband, I lost my brother, I lost everybody.
Wow.
And there was a moment after that, there was a winter after that, where I slipped in the driveway and I hit the back of my head and I lay in the ice. And I have this very powerful memory, like a sense memory of, I had this feeling that I could close my eyes and just not get up. And it was not a bad feeling. Actually, it's crazy, but it was like, yeah, this feels good, actually. I could do this. And I live in an area where in the middle of the day, people would not find me for many, many hours. And then something else came in, and I can't really point to exactly what it was, but I forced my eyes open, I pushed my eyes open, and I got up. And in that moment, if I were making a film, that I think it's truthful that I got up a different person than the person who had slipped in the driveway. And what was that? I could have gone, and I'm not saying it wouldn't have affected anybody, but, life would go on. I hate to admit that, but it would. I could have just fallen asleep. I could have just gone into that feeling of peace, and I didn't. And I woke up different. And the way I woke up different was I imagined that there was more to do. And that sometimes is very tiny and sometimes it's more, bigger, more ostentatious, at least in my head. But that idea that I had something to offer that was important. So for me, this idea of falling apart is very related on a personal level and on a larger level to letting go of the status quo, which is so comfy, to letting go of many of my defenses, which is a big, that's a big warm blanket, my judgment of you and my judgment of that and my judgment of this. Oh, it's so cozy, right? I get to be right. I get to be smarter. I get to be more righteous, letting go of some of that. So for me, falling apart has a lot to do with this, the falling apart. And when I think about getting up off that driveway, I know I don't mean to make it all sugary, but there is something terrifying about, obviously, everything's terrifying, politically, climate, everything. And there's something just a touch exciting. There is something for me that is a touch exciting. It has to do with having the courage and the capacity for change, which I have to say, in my little cynical heart, truthfully, I believe we do have that. And I look at somebody like Greta, and I look at her face, and like you, Leslie, I'm trying not to kneel at her altar. But
Greta Thunberg, by the way, for people
yes,
who don't have an immediate.
but
a
I
16-year-old from
I'm happy to follow.
Norway. Yeah.
And what am I happy to follow? Her audacity, her voice, her faith. As much as she's yelling at all of us, she's yelling because she has faith. And I suppose I have it too. So I learned that in getting up from that very cozy place where I could have just fallen asleep.
And before I go back to Jane for a little exercise, I want to acknowledge, Suzi, you as well. You have at least, all of our workshops are going to be connected to this theme, but the one of yours that you're working on that sounds most connected to this that I'm remembering is the we and they one.
Yeah.
Could you say a word about what you're hoping to do in that workshop?
Yeah, it is actually to get back to our imaginations. I think it's very hard to imagine at this moment that there is, and I almost don't want to say the word, I think it's a dirty, boring word at this point, polarization. So there, I've said it. And that, well, if you think of the two poles and then you think of the thread, getting back to the largest circle, so in my sense, that first starts here. Hellinger had a book, and he was very powerful about this way back when. Peace begins in the soul. You cannot work out there and be violent in here. It just doesn't work. So that getting back to imagination, getting back to this place where we can find one another again. And that includes things like boundaries. It doesn't exclude them. Boundaries are essential. It's absolutely essential, right? So again, sort of not a Pollyanna-ish idea, but a courageous coming together with our differences, and also knowing where we shouldn't be, because it brings out the pettiness in us. It brings out the judgment in us. It brings out the littleness in us. So I guess that it is finding this largest circle again. Brené Brown talked, I heard her the other day. I had no idea who I was listening to. I was like, who is this tough broad? I liked her.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd actually ever heard her before, but she was talking about this idea of moving past tribalism, not to a more enlightened place, but to a more primal place. And that really resonated with me, that place where we're not so sophisticated in a certain way, where we are human beings, the primal place. So look at your cat, okay, and cats, human beings and felines.
This is cat pacification here.
Yeah. And animals, I notice regularly, are not divided against themselves in quite the way we manage to do.
Yes.
And I want to name that we, again, navigating transitions in global and personal identity. Wherever you are and whatever you bring, we want to be able to work both at the really sort of personal level, whatever that means to you, and at larger levels, and to be able to feel comfortable between them. We're not required to just, think at a social scale or only at a personal scale. That whatever aches or desire for growth and learning that you have, we will work from that place. I did want to acknowledge that there's a question here from Pinar. My apologies if I've mispronounced your name, saying, I was introduced to constellation work through Professor Franz Rupert's IOPT, the identity, or that I can't remember all of the letters, identity-oriented psychotrauma. wondering how it is different from Bert's work. I want to honor that's an excellent question. It's a question a lot of people have. My apologies, I'm not going to make room for it today. Feel free to email me. I'd be happy to engage you on that.
I was going to say, yeah.
It'll take us down a little bit of an alleyway that we don't have room for today. But it is relevant. They're connected, and I'd be happy to respond to you personally about that. It's a really good question. So I want to make sure we do a little bit more experience. And again, if you have a question, if anything these folks have said or I've said is raise a question, do the little hand thing or a question in the chat. But I haven't seen that yet. So Jane, with cat in hand.
Let's see if she's sufficiently pacified. She's the office manager here. I have to keep her happy.
No, I have the same issue. That's why I always feed the cat before I do a webinar. Pacification indeed. Would you take us through a short little experience, please?
Yeah, so a lot of my work also has been around the body. So my tech assistant is helping me get some power into my computer here. It's the embodiment. It's the actual embodied physical life that we have to deal with. These abstract ideas are lovely, but there's also the actual practical of being alive in a human body and what that means. And so one of the things I learned in my work when I started experimenting with what we know physically about our families and where we come from. And I'll just mention there's a book that came out with the title, You Are What Your Grandmother Ate. So that's putting it as practically and as embodied terms as I can think of. So one of the things I learned is that I could start by standing with somebody and just gently inquiring about the way they showed up, and I could find their family. I could find how that family was influencing their physical self. So the way we are literally in our bodies, the way we move, the way we talk, the way we, feel ourselves is shaped by the interactions with people that are close to us over these interactions. And so just to give you a little taste of that, I'm going to invite you to, first of all, just take a moment and actually find your physical body. That by finding your center of gravity. So I'm going to invite you to actually lean forward a little bit, lean back a little bit, so you can feel that there's a place of balance there. And the same if you go a little to the left, a little to the right. You'll find that there's actually a place of poise, of just balance. And that's where you're actually physically kind of lined up and centered. So I'm going to ask you to just find that place of sort of poise where your body is balanced. And you can actually feel that you're stable and feel yourself kind of settle there. Now I'm going to ask you, if you just rest in that space a moment, to notice where you feel your mother. Is she close to you? Is she far? Is she on your left or your right, front or back? Does she look at you? Does she turn away? How do you feel her presence in relationship to your body? And just notice that it's really present for us. We can call that to mind. We can feel where somebody that important to us stands in relation to our own body. And if you imagine that that is actually a dance that's been unfolding over time, you might even be able to feel like a stone that's dropped into a pond the waves and the ripples of that relationship that have shaped you in a physical way over time. And just notice what that sensation is like. There's nothing to do about it. It's just noticing that we sort of carry our constellation with us in the way that we live in our physical form all the time. And we can do the same with a father or a partner or any person that we've had a long-term relationship with. There's a resonance of that interaction in our physical form, in our physical being. So that over time, we're like a pool where many stones have been dropped, and the ripples and the patterns they form when they cross and merge have become a part of our physical being. When we do constellations and we ask you to follow your felt sense of where people are, when I first saw this, I thought, how do they do that? And it turns out that our bodies are these amazing, like musical instruments, and the strings are always vibrating with the patterns of the music that we've played with others for a long period of time. And so that's part of what underlies this amazing process that we do, is there's wisdom, there's 4 billion years of evolution in that physical body, that physical form. There's amazing wisdom and magic there. And I just like to stop and honor that we do know where each person is in our constellation. We feel those patterns over time. And just say hi to mom in whatever way feels right to you. And acknowledge that you shaped her and she shaped you. And that we're never really truly a separate person. I like to say the individual is the wrong unit of measure. That's my old science self talking. But it's really feeling that we are made up out of all these interactions over time, really on a physical level. So come on back. Just noticing what that experiment was like. We could do that for every member of your family. But that's just a little taste of going through the doorway of the wisdom of the physical self to find the patterns in relationship.
Thank you so much for that, Jane. That was just yummy. And for all the students of the work who are on the call, some of you are, some of you aren't, but those of you who are students of the work, you just got a master class on how to introduce this work to people in a way that's not mystifying, that's really concrete and generally more or less graspable by most people. Steal,
yes, please.
this wonderful work.
Take everything you can.
And I often hear this from students, like, how do I help people learn how to represent or whatever? And again, if you're new to constellations, I'm speaking a little bit more to those with higher expertise in the group right now. Jane's really a great teacher in this regard. So thank you for that. That was lovely. Suzi, would you share with us what you have prepared? And I'm going to unmute you. There you go.
Thank you. So it's funny, Jane, we have to swear that we did not speak to one another before this call.
And this is where I go all like woo-woo. It's like, ooh, the field.
There is no individual, Leslie. Let's just get over that.
I'm going to read a short piece. So I write, and I I always quote Flannery O'Connor on this, that I write not because I understand things, but I write in order to understand things. And so before this call, I chose to read something based on, I don't know what exactly, but it's called History Talks Back. There you were, first thing in the morning, not in my room or in my mind, not even in my memory. You were in my body, wrapped across my shoulders and chest. I'd experienced this once before when I recognized my brother, your son, behind my eyebrows. I'd never met him before, but on that day, I felt him there above my eyes. I knew him there. I looked across the room and found him among the other patients because I could feel him. And this morning, Mom, I knew you in my body some 10 years after your death. Did you think I would forget you? I look in the mirror and you are looking back. My heart skitters off rhythm and there you are. My coffee's so strong friends won't drink it and I think of you. When I cannot find the word, I simply pluck one from your expansive vocabulary. I can't sing either. You occupy so many moments on any given day. This morning was different, of course. You were me as I was you. You occupied me. To my surprise, I did not attempt to shake you off or push you out. I felt within myself a kind of shelter for your being. As a child and long into adulthood, I was terrified that I would be absorbed or suffocated by your disappointment and fear. There were times I refused to love you in order to protect myself. I regret that. There was another way, but I couldn't see it through the fog of my own burgeoning disappointment and fear. We are so much alike, always were. In building a wall between us, I had dedicated myself to the narrowness up your ways in the world, the ones I felt so constricted by. We are so much alike. There, I've said it. In acknowledging it, in knowing it, I feel freer to make other choices. When I look back at the younger me, I see that opposition requires turning directly toward what one is opposing. And thus, that young woman is clearly turning her back on any chance for change. She did fine, nonetheless, no regrets. It's just that in this moment, I want to let that younger me know that agreement is breath, that breeze that will let her pivot gently, leaving what cannot be carried by another in order to take her own life forward. Mom, you arrived this morning in a way I hadn't known before. Welcome.
I do not believe that the two of you did not consult. Oh, okay, so I'm going to just take 1 minute here and invite you to imagine. I mean, there are people on this group who are registered for the intensive. There are people who are considering the intensive. There's people who are like, nope, can't do that for any one of them. A number of reasons. We're really glad you're here. But for those of you who may be on the fence, I just invite you to imagine what it would be like to continue this conversation and do a lot more practice with these folk and with a lot of other really wonderful people who will come. For those of you who know you can't or won't come, I just invite you to imagine your local work, you know, your local trainers, your local workshops, just, you know, the things you are going to go to and enjoy or lead. Suzi reminds us frequently that Bert Hellinger was very generous with this work. He had the Let Many Flowers Bloom perspective. He wanted to see it practiced in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different places. And this is so. And honored to offer one little tiny version of this, but a really good one in Northern California in June. So I'm going to grab your screens for 1 second. And for those of you who are on the phone, you're not going to be able to see it. But I just want to give you this information. There are the dates, June 10th to 14th, 2020, Northern California, a little town called San Rafael. It's right next to, it's very convenient to the San Francisco airport. And so it's, you know, if you're thinking, I've never been to the Bay Area, I've never been to San Francisco, it's, you know, great to hook it up with a vacation and experience some of the extraordinary beauty of this region. It would be a good part of it. We have a super early bird ending on February 5th. So you have a little while to think about it, although singles are running out. But the next price level goes up after February 5th. And there is the link. If you can't see it, it is westcoastconstellations.com. Again, westcoastconstellations.com. If you go there, you'll get all the information, where, how much, schedule. We'll be having information about workshops up really, really, really soon. All the details about the lodging and the location. It's a very comprehensive and well-detailed website. Again, westcoastconstellations.com. And if you need to ask questions, go to that website and you will find an email to ask those questions of, who is mostly Christina, yay, who receives your emails and will answer your questions. So before we leave, thank you so much for coming. I cannot tell you the sense of honor I have at even being like, on my screen, everybody's screen is different, but Jane is on my right and Suzi's on my left. And they're right there for me in my Hollywood squares. It's just a really honor to be affiliated and associated with them at all, and to play and dream and think about these things. Before we leave, Jane, any last comment, share, experience that you would like to offer up?
Yeah, I think what I would say, we touched on it a little bit earlier when we talked about containment, is that there's the other important part of falling apart is coming together. And that I do hope you'll come, because there's something about being together in person that is not the same as being there virtually. So I hope you'll bring that body and join us.
That's nice. May I say something?
Yes, I'm asking you to, please.
Thank you. Yes, that's beautiful, Jane. So I had the great honor, this is my second time, and I was so thrilled. So I can tell you a little bit from my experience last year. I would say that this is, you know, again, Bird has this the paradoxical, it's kind of a paradoxical work, right? In that, in some ways, it's quite simple, right? I could tell you probably in 5 sentences the sort of simple philosophical through line on some level. But as soon as we start talking about people, it becomes very complex. And so this venue, and really in the hands of Leslie's vision, really, I know it's a little bit of a mixed metaphor there, but the hands of her vision. And I believe yes, and I believe Christina is a great addition to this. The many, many threads, and the different voices in the teaching, and the different formats of the workshops, and the conversations that people have on the way to the bathroom that, you know, light bulbs go off. It's a very unusual venue, and it's very, very rich.
Yes, conversations over meals is where the real constellation work happens, right?
No joke. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
true.
Yeah, thank you. And then Christina, just real quickly, you're also a returnee.
Yes.
What would you say about the intensive?
It's exactly what it says it is. It's intensive.
Yeah.
The first year I went, I loved it, and I went again. And every year, I just feel so full and like I've taken a step forward in this practice. And it's a great community, really wonderful people to connect with.
Yeah. Thank you. From more of the participant angle. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to unmute you all, which gives you an opportunity to noisily say goodbye.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, all. And have a lovely day. Our blessings to you.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah.
Bye, Leslie.